Okay, we had just finished talking about the response generator, so let's go to the next slide. So what I want you to do is imagine that you watched someone in the classroom, and every 3 seconds for an hour you recorded what that person is doing. So that would be 1,200 observations, 20 a minute for 60 minutes. Now, the list of behaviors you see here, yawning, smiling, writing, etc., are things that I observed watching a classmate, watching someone in a classroom. The number beside it is how many times I saw it in those 1,200 observations. For simplicity, at this moment, we're going to exclude the possibility that someone might be smiling and writing at the same time, or scratching and laughing at the same time. Let's assume that we're only going to record one response, one behavior per observation. So what I want you to think about is this. What's the habit strength of the behavior? Well, it's the probability of the behavior. A behavior that occurs more often has higher habit strength. So the probability is defined as the number of times the behavior is observed divided by the total number of observations. So you can see I've illustrated that with the example of yawning. 15 out of the 1,200 observations were yawning. So yawning has a probability of only 0.01. It's not a very likely behavior. So this figure, next slide, you can see here we have a figure in which I've plotted the probability of those same behaviors from most probable to least probable. So in this habit family hierarchy, writing has the highest habit strength. Laughing, looking to the side, etc. So you can see smiling is kind of intermediate. It's down around the 0.04 probability. Not very likely, but not nearly as rare as crying. Now, let's suppose that someone in the class began to notice you, and every time you made eye contact and smiled, the person gave you a warm reciprocating smile. That is, the consequence of smiling changed. That would increase the chances of smiling, the probability of smiling. The response generator would throw out smiles more often. You can see with the second figure, the red figure, smiling has gone from a 0.04 probability to a 0.3 probability. This is an enormous change. The only thing you do more than smiling in this class is write. Next slide. So we need a way to sort of describe that effect. And for historical completeness, I'm going to talk about the first such description, but I will forewarn you, I'm going to discount Thorndike's law of effect. So let's consider Thorndike's law of effect and how well it works. Next slide. All right, here is the exact wording of Thorndike's law of effect. Of several responses made to the same situation, those which are accompanied or closely followed by satisfaction to the animal will, other things being equal, be more firmly connected to the situation. Notice I have added emphasis to the word satisfaction because for me there's a problem with this definition, and it's in that word. How do you operationally define satisfaction? Well, the way it is often defined operationally is if the consequence of satisfying the behavior increased. On the surface, that seems reasonable. However, I then have to ask the question, why did the behavior increase? And the answer is because the consequence was satisfying. So do you see we have a problem here? We define a consequence of satisfying if behavior increases, but then explain the behavior increased because it was satisfying. This is what is known as a circular definition. Circular definitions are problematic because there's no way to disprove it. If it increases, it's satisfying. It increased because it was satisfying. Well, if it didn't increase, it's because it wasn't satisfying. We know it wasn't satisfying because it didn't. There's no way to prove or disprove this. If you can't define satisfying apart from its effect, and the effect can only be explained if it's satisfying, that is bad. Now, from this point forward, I will start using the terms reinforcer or punisher as different consequences of behavior. And initially, it will appear that I'm using the same sort of circular logic. It's a reinforcer if behavior increases, it's a punisher if behavior decreases. Later, I will give you non-circular definitions to explain what constitutes a reinforcer and punisher. We do have those, but at this point, don't be fooled just because it appears that I'm defining a reinforcer as anything that increases behavior. So, I hope you can reflect on this problem of circularity and see why Thorndike's statement is problematic. Next slide. Next slide. All right, so let me introduce or consider this thing the text introduces called the stop action principle. Next slide. A lot of what the text talks about in stop action is very abstract and elusive, and you can disregard it, except for one thing. It is useful in the sense that it helps us understand an important experiment by Skinner. So, let's start with defining a non-contingent event or non-contingent reinforcer. So, if I arrange to present food to a hungry individual occasionally, without regard to what the individual is doing, that is a non-contingent event, non-contingent reinforcer, because it would probably have an effect on behavior. Well, the non-contingent event will have an effect on behavior because, this is the third paragraph, it stops the ongoing response generation for a moment. So the response generator isn't going to generate new behavior if some non-contingent event occurs. It's going to just pause. Thus, that will reduce the variety of behaviors. If the response generator isn't free to just keep cranking out new responses, behavior becomes less variable. Thus, non-contingent events, non-contingent food, for example, will reduce the variability of behavior. If behavior is less variable, then whatever is occurring will necessarily move higher in the habit family hierarchy. That appears to be learning. It appears that non-contingent reinforcement changes behavior or affects learning. And this is exactly what Skinner saw in one of his very famous experiments, where he argued that non-contingent events both select for or reduce the variability of behavior and strengthen behavior. This is the what is known as the superstition experiment. So next slide, be prepared to address the procedure, findings, and conclusion of Skinner, 1948. Next slide. That is, as you can see at the bottom, the superstition in the pigeon experiment. So let's look at the procedure here. Pigeons were food deprived to 75% of their free feeding weight. This is a common procedural element we will see over and over again. 75% of your free feeding weight is probably a little more than you right now. We do not free feed. Free feed would be what we would weigh if we had unlimited access to food 24 hours a day. We are all under some food deprivation. Thus, generally, food is an attractive consequence. So the pigeons were maintained at a slightly food deprived level. They were put into an experimental chamber. And in the chamber, food was presented for 5 seconds at regular moments completely independent of the bird's behavior. So food is just presented. Next slide. The findings were that all the birds, 6 of the 8 birds, came to engage in specific behaviors at regular times in between food presentations. So here's a list of what the different birds did, and you can see it's quite variable. It does appear the birds are developing idiosyncratic but specific responses when food is presented occasionally. Only subjects 7 and 8 did not have specific, repeatable, or repeating responses. Now, it's important to note there was nothing about the chamber that did this. The stereotypic responses only appeared after food was made available occasionally. Next slide. Skinner's conclusion is that the bird happened to be engaging in a response as food was presented. As a result, that response became stronger, behavior became less variable, and the behavior was repeated. So you can see my middle sentence. Presenting food stopped ongoing variation in behavior and increased the strength of that behavior. Then a stereotypy would appear. That is, the pigeon became more likely to repeat that behavior. This was consistent with something Skinner observed. The shorter the interval between food, the more rapidly stereotypy or superstition appeared. If you had longer intervals between food so that the response generator could re-engage, then the pigeon's behavior became more diverse. So the conclusion Skinner reached was that occasional presentation of food, independent of any relationship between food and behavior, both reduced variability and strengthened the, quote, superstitious response. And his final piece of evidence arguing for superstition, strong superstitious behaviors, was the fact that when food was no longer presented, he would sometimes see many thousands of the superstitious responses occur before it disappeared. Next slide. So, to conclude this experiment, the contingent reinforcement, not what Skinner did, contingent reinforcement will strengthen a response and reduce variability. I'm going to try and make that case strongly as we go through this unit. But Skinner wanted to assign all the superstitious effects to the change in strengthening behavior. And he argued that behavior grows more likely when it's followed by even a non-contingent event, a non-contingent reinforcer, because the behavior is made stronger. I'm going to make the case that is not occurring with non-contingent events. That is, there has to be a relationship between behavior and the reinforcer if behavior is going to get stronger. However, clearly behavior became less variable. That is, the stereotypic or superstitious behavior occurred more and more often, but it was because variability was reduced, not because strength increased. I recognize this is a little elusive, so don't panic. We will work it out as we go through the semester. Next slide.